Something about the timing doesn't feel random. If you've been following the news closely, you've probably felt it too. Not just the headlines, but the way events are unfolding, the pace, the shift, the sudden change in focus. One moment, the conversation is dominated by one story, a story tied to power, secrecy, and questions that have lingered for years. And then, almost abruptly, the attention moves somewhere else. A different headline, a different urgency, a different kind of fear. And the question that quietly begins to circulate is this: is this a coincidence or something more deliberate? Because when you look at the sequence of events, it's hard not to notice the pattern. Public attention had been building around renewed discussions connected to the Epstein case. Not just the past, but the possibility of new information, new scrutiny, and new pressure on figures tied to that world. It wasn't just a niche topic anymore. It was gaining traction, more conversations, more speculation, more demand for answers, and then almost at the same time, the focus shifted rapidly. Suddenly, the dominant narrative became something else entirely, an escalating situation involving Iran, military developments, strategic movements, rising tensions that demanded immediate attention. And just like that, the spotlight moved from one story to another. Now, on the surface, this could be exactly what it appears to be. Two separate events, two different timelines, one happening after the other. That's the simplest explanation. But it's not the only one people are considering, because history has shown that timing in politics is rarely ignored. It's studied, it's analyzed, and sometimes it's used. That doesn't mean every shift is intentional. But it does mean that when a major narrative suddenly overtakes another, especially one that carries potential consequences, people start asking questions. And those questions don't come from nowhere. They come from patterns people believe they've seen before. Moments where attention is redirected, where focus changes quickly, where something that seemed central becomes secondary almost overnight. Now, whether those patterns are real or perceived, that's where the debate begins. Because on one side, there are those who believe this is exactly how global events unfold, unpredictably, unconnected, driven by circumstances that have nothing to do with each other. From that perspective, the escalation involving Iran is simply the result of ongoing tensions reaching a new phase. Strategic decisions, regional dynamics, a situation that has been building for a long time. And if that's the case, then the timing is just that. Timing, nothing more. But on the other side, there are voices raising a different possibility, not as a conclusion, but as a question. What if the shift in attention wasn't entirely accidental? What if in moments where pressure builds in one area, movement in another becomes useful not necessarily as a direct cause, but as a distraction, a redirection, a way to change the conversation? Now, this idea isn't new. It's been discussed in different forms for years. The concept that when attention becomes uncomfortable, it can sometimes be moved, not erased, not eliminated, but overshadowed. And in a world where information moves fast and attention moves even faster, that kind of shift can be powerful. Because what dominates the headlines often defines what people focus on. And what people focus on shapes what they question. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence that links these two developments directly. No official statement, no documented strategy. Nothing that proves intention. But that doesn't stop the conversation from happening, because the question itself, whether grounded or speculative, touches on something deeper. Trust. Trust in how events unfold. Trust in how information is presented. Trust in whether what we see is always the full picture. And once that question enters the conversation, it tends to stay there, not always loudly, sometimes quietly, in discussions, in comments, in private thoughts. Because even if the answer is uncertain, the timing is real. One story rising, another taking over, and a shift that feels significant enough to notice. Now, step back for a moment. Look at the broader environment. We're in a time where information moves faster than ever, where narratives can change within hours, where attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. In that kind of environment, it becomes harder to separate coincidence from pattern. Harder to know what is connected and what is not. And that uncertainty creates space. Space for questions, space for interpretations, space for theories that try to explain what feels unclear. Some of those theories will be grounded, some will not, but all of them are part of the same underlying dynamic. People trying to understand what's really happening and why. Now, as this particular situation continues to develop, that question remains at the center, not as a claim, but as a possibility that people are exploring. Could the escalation involving Iran be entirely independent of everything else? Absolutely. Could it also have the effect of shifting attention away from something else? Also possible. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. Because in complex systems, outcomes don't always have a single cause. They can have multiple layers, multiple effects, some intentional, some not. And sometimes what matters most is not what was intended, but what actually happens as a result. Right now, what's happening is clear. The focus has shifted, the conversation has changed, and the attention of millions of people has moved in a new direction. Whether that shift was planned or simply the result of unfolding events, that's the part that remains unresolved. And that's exactly where the deeper analysis begins. Because to understand whether there's any connection at all, you have to go beyond the surface, beyond the headlines, into the timeline, into the sequence of events, into what was happening before and what changed after. Because sometimes the answer isn't found in what is said, it's found in how things unfold. And when you start to look closely at that unfolding, you begin to see details that aren't obvious at first glance, details that don't immediately prove anything, but that raise even more questions. And those questions lead directly into what comes next.
To understand why this question is gaining traction, you have to step back and look at the sequence, not just the events themselves, but how they unfolded in relation to each other. Because timing in situations like this is everything. Not just what happens, but when it happens. And when you start placing these events side by side, a pattern begins to emerge, not a conclusion, not proof, but a sequence that feels unusually aligned. In the days leading up to the current escalation, attention had been steadily building around renewed conversations tied to the Epstein case. It wasn't just background noise anymore. There were discussions resurfacing across media, social platforms, and political circles. Questions that had once faded were being asked again, with more urgency. Who knew what? Who was connected? And more importantly, what hasn't been fully revealed yet? The kind of questions that don't disappear easily once they gain momentum because they touch on power, on influence, on accountability. And those are the kinds of topics that tend to grow, not shrink. Now, at the same time, there were already tensions in the Middle East. That's not new. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been complex for years, filled with moments of escalation, pauses, and strategic signaling. So when developments began to accelerate in that region, it wasn't entirely out of nowhere. There were indicators, movements, signals that something was building. But what stands out isn't just that things escalated, it's how quickly that escalation became the dominant story. Almost overnight, the focus shifted from questions about the past to concerns about the present, from speculation to urgency, from investigation to immediate risk. And in that shift, the previous conversation didn't disappear, but it was pushed out of the center, replaced by something that demanded more attention. Now again, there are two ways to look at this. One is straightforward. Two separate developments happened around the same time. One naturally overtook the other because of its scale and immediacy. That's how news works. The most urgent story takes priority, and a geopolitical escalation, especially one involving military activity, will always dominate the cycle. From that perspective, the timing is just a coincidence, a convergence of unrelated events, nothing more. But then there's the second way to look at it, and this is where the questions begin. Because when attention shifts this dramatically, this quickly, people start to notice not just the shift, but the effect of the shift. What changed? What stopped being discussed as much? What moved from the front page to the background? Because attention is limited, there's only so much space at the top of the conversation. And when something new takes that space, something else has to give. Now here's where it becomes more interesting. Because the Epstein-related discussions weren't just fading naturally, they were intensifying. More voices, more curiosity, more pressure for clarity. And then suddenly, the conversation moved. Not gradually, but sharply. That kind of transition is what creates the sense that something doesn't quite align. Not as evidence, but as perception. And perception, especially in a media-driven environment, plays a powerful role. Because people don't just react to facts, they react to patterns, to what feels consistent or inconsistent, to what seems expected. And this shift, this rapid change in focus, felt unexpected enough to trigger that reaction. Now let's take a closer look at how fast this happened. Within a very short window, headlines changed, coverage changed, conversations changed, topics that were being actively discussed became less visible, not gone, but no longer central. And in their place, a new narrative took over. One that required constant updates, continuous coverage, immediate attention, because when something is ongoing, when it's developing in real time, it naturally pulls focus, it demands it, and that's exactly what happened here. The escalation involving Iran became the story, not one of many, but the story, and once that happens, everything else adjusts around it. Now, this doesn't prove intent, it doesn't confirm coordination, but it does establish context. A context where one major narrative was rising and another suddenly took its place. And that's enough to raise questions, because in environments where information is constantly competing for attention, timing can shape outcomes, not just what people see, but what they focus on. And what they focus on shapes what they remember. Now consider this. If the Epstein-related discussions had continued to grow without interruption, where would that conversation be now? Would it have gained more traction, more visibility, more pressure? It's impossible to know for certain, but the trajectory suggested it was moving in that direction. And then something else happened, something bigger, something more immediate, something that required a shift. Now again, this could all be coincidence, a natural sequence of events, but it could also be something more complex, not necessarily a direct connection, but an overlap where one development had the effect of overshadowing another, and sometimes in strategic environments, effects matter just as much as intentions. Because whether something is planned or not, if it changes the conversation, it changes the outcome. Now, this brings us to another important layer, decision-making. Because escalation doesn't happen randomly. It involves choices, assessments, evaluations of risk and timing. So when a major escalation occurs, it's not just about what's happening externally. It's also about internal calculations. What moment is chosen, what signals are being sent, what priorities are being addressed. And while we don't have access to those internal discussions, we can observe the timing, and that timing is what's driving the current debate. Because when two significant developments occur close together, and one dramatically overtakes the other, people start asking whether that overlap is purely accidental, or whether timing itself played a role. Now, this doesn't lead to a definitive answer. It leads to a deeper question, and that question is not just about what happened, but why it happened when it did. Because in situations like this, the when can be just as important as the what. And as we move forward, the focus shifts from timing to motivation. Because if timing raises questions, motivation is where those questions begin to take shape. Why would attention need to shift? Who benefits from that shift? And how do those benefits influence the decisions being made? Those are the questions that take this conversation to the next level. And they are not simple. They involve layers, perspectives, interpretations that don't always align, but they all point in the same direction, trying to understand what's really driving what we're seeing right now. And that's where the analysis goes deeper, because once you move beyond the timeline, you start looking at intent, and that's where things become even more complicated. At this point, the question has been asked from every angle, the timing has been examined, the sequence has been laid out, the possibilities have been explored. But now it comes down to something deeper, not just what happened, not just when it happened, but what it all means. Because even without a clear answer, the impact of this situation is already unfolding, and that impact goes beyond one event or one narrative. It touches something much broader, how people interpret reality in a world where information moves fast, attention shifts quickly, and trust is constantly being tested. Right now, there are two parallel realities forming. In one version, everything is exactly what it appears to be, a geopolitical escalation driven by long-standing tensions, strategic interests, and evolving regional dynamics. In this view, the timing, however striking, is still coincidence. Two major developments happening close together, but for completely separate reasons, nothing more. And for many, that explanation is enough, because it aligns with how global events often unfold, complex, unpredictable, and sometimes overlapping in ways that feel surprising. But then there's the other version, the one that doesn't settle as easily, the one that keeps asking, why now? Why this moment? Why this shift? Not as a conclusion, but as a lingering question that refuses to go away. Because once people begin to notice patterns, real or perceived, they start looking for meaning inside them. And meaning doesn't always require proof. It requires plausibility, something that feels possible, something that fits into a broader understanding of how power and influence can operate. And that's where this conversation becomes less about facts alone and more about interpretation, because interpretation fills the gaps where certainty doesn't exist. Now here's where things become even more important, because regardless of which version someone believes, The effect is the same, the conversation has shifted, the focus has moved, and the attention of millions has been redirected. That alone changes the landscape, because attention is not neutral. It determines what gets discussed, what gets questioned, what gets remembered, and when attention moves, those things move with it. So even if there is no direct connection between the Epstein-related discussions and the escalation involving Iran, the outcome is still significant, because one narrative has taken center stage and the other has moved out of the spotlight, not disappeared, but diminished in visibility. And in a world driven by visibility, that matters. Now think about how quickly that shift happened, how one topic dominated and then was replaced, how conversations changed direction, how urgency redefined what people were paying attention to. That speed is what makes this moment stand out, because it highlights something fundamental about the modern information environment. It's not just about what is true, it's about what is seen. And what is seen is often shaped by what is most immediate, most dramatic, most urgent. Now, that doesn't mean manipulation, it doesn't mean intent, but it does mean that outcomes can align in ways that raise questions. And those questions, whether answered or not, become part of the narrative. They influence how people think, how they interpret future events, how they respond to new developments. Because once a question like this enters the conversation, it doesn't disappear easily. It evolves, it adapts, it becomes part of the way people analyze what comes next. Now, let's step back one more time, because beyond the specifics of this situation, there's a broader takeaway, something that applies not just here, but to many moments like this. In complex systems, whether political, economic, or informational, events don't always have clear single explanations. They overlap, they interact, they create outcomes that are shaped by multiple factors at once, some intentional, some not. And trying to reduce those outcomes to one cause can sometimes miss the bigger picture. At the same time, ignoring patterns entirely can also leave important questions unexplored. So the balance lies somewhere in between. Acknowledging what is known, recognizing what is uncertain, and staying aware of how quickly things can change. Because change is constant. Narratives shift, focus moves, new developments take over. And what feels central one moment can become secondary the next. That's the environment we're in, and it's not slowing down. Now, as this situation continues to evolve, the key question is no longer just about the past. It's about what happens next. Will the current focus remain? Will the previous conversation return to the spotlight? Will new developments emerge that shift attention again? Because if there's one thing that's clear, it's that attention is never fixed. It moves, and where it moves shapes everything that follows. So whether this was coincidence or something more layered, the real impact is already happening in how people are thinking, in what they're focusing on, in the questions they're asking. And those questions don't just define this moment, they define how the next moment will be understood. Because once you start looking at events this way, you don't just see what's happening, you start asking why it's happening now. And that question, more than anything else, is what keeps people watching, keeps the conversation going.